This is the first of 5 podcasts that look at the Nazi Party and the Weimar Republic in the middle years of the 1920s, the so-called Golden Era. At least it was the Golden Era for the Weimar Republic and the government in Berlin, not so much of a golden era for the Nazi Party. So we're looking at the period 1924 to 29. Now this first podcast will focus in on Gustav Stresemann, and in particular his foreign policy, which sort of set the tone for what was happening in Germany at that time. So there's the mind map, which we used in the revision session. As always with these mind maps, we sort of start around about 1 or 2 o'clock. If you imagine it as a clock, we will rotate around. So we're starting with Stresemann and Conciliation abroad. That's what we're going to cover in this first podcast. Second one, we'll look at the economic agreements, move into the issue of was there recovery, and then the Nazi Party 24 to 29, and the final podcast will look at the beginning of the crisis, 1929. So we'll start off with this particular strand here, Stresemann and Conciliation abroad. Okay, first of all then, who exactly was Gustav Stresemann? A key figure in the Weimar Republic's recovery after 1924. Actually, he was only briefly, the Chancellor. Remember, in the Weimar Republic, the Chancellor is equivalent to our Prime Minister. In England today, he was the head of government. Okay, not the head of state. Remember, the head of state is a figurehead. He worked under 2 heads of state. First of all, Hebert, who was president until 1925, and then in 1925, Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I hero and general, was elected president, and he continued to be president until 1932, and then he was re-elected as president. Anyway, Gustav Stresemann was the Chancellor, the head of government. For most of the time when he was in office, he was actually the foreign minister. Briefly, he was the Chancellor, but he was the foreign minister for most of his time in office. One of the things he's most famous for was taking firm action to resolve the hyperinflation of 1923. Okay, so obviously 1923 was that crisis year. It very much was part of that sort of series of disasters that hit the Republic in the first 5 years. So remember, it started off with the abdication of the Kaiser, leading to the Spartacist uprising in 1919, Treaty of Versailles in June 1919, ongoing inflation, the cap putsch, and then the French invasion of the war, the hyperinflation at the beginning of 1923, leading through to the Munich putsch at the end of 1923, whole atmosphere of crisis that the Republic was never going to survive these awful years. And then suddenly Stresemann appears on the scene as Chancellor, and he took firm action. He introduced a new temporary currency called the Rentenmark, which was based on the value of German land, not on gold. Very, very brave decision. It was effectively like mortgaging the whole of the country, but it worked. It created confidence in the currency. At the same time, he recognised the fact that the previous government's policy of just printing lots of money was actually making the problem of hyperinflation worse. So he limited the amount of money that the government was printing. And those 2 actions between them brought hyperinflation under control, which was a huge step in towards rebuilding public confidence in the government in Berlin, which the other side of that was people began to turn their support back to the government in Berlin, and they turned their support away from the extremist parties, which were the communists on the extreme left and extreme right-wing opponents on the extreme right. Now, as we said, Stresemann then didn't serve as Chancellor very long, but he continued to be the sort of engine room of the government for the next 4 or 5 years until his premature death in September 1929. And his main role, his main contribution was as Foreign Minister and setting the tone for setting the tone for the whole of Germany's policy at this time. He ended Germany's isolation from the world. Quick word on what exactly that meant. 1919, Germany was punished by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so the Allies very much treated Germany as, don't use this word in an answer, but the bad country, effectively. She was the guilty country and she needed to be punished. German people, all German people, felt that that was a grave injustice. And even the government in Berlin, which had cooperated with the Treaty of Versailles, behind the scenes, most of the members of the government resented the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, in particular the war guilt clause. Now that set the tone for German policy in the first 5 years. They dragged their feet. They didn't cooperate. They did as little as they could to cooperate with the Allies, who they saw were punishing them. It's what we call a hard line policy in the first 4 or 5 years, refusing really to cooperate with the British and the French in particular. Now, Stresemann basically looked at that policy and he said, look, World War I ended 5 years ago now. Treaty of Versailles will be around a long, long time. We need to basically pull ourselves as a country out of the hole that we've dug ourselves, and the only way we can really do that is if we get support from the British and the French. And we're never going to get their support and their cooperation if we show resentment towards them. So we've got to change our approach towards the British and the French. We've got to basically accept the terms of the Treaty of Versailles rather than constantly complain about them, and we've got to work with the British and the French. So that foreign policy is what we call a policy of conciliation, or a conciliatory policy. So it's a good word for you to use there, that word conciliatory. Not many candidates in the GCSE exam would actually use that word, so try to learn it and emphasise that Stresemann's policy was based on reconciliation or a conciliatory policy. Now, the examples of that policy are there. Just learn these examples. First of all, he signed the Locarno Treaty with Britain, France, Belgium and Italy. It was a series of treaties. They were signed in 1925. Locarno is a place in Switzerland, I think. Basically, by these treaties, Germany recognised her revised frontiers in the west. Okay, so remember, she lost Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium, and she lost the Alsace-Lorraine to France. And effectively, Germany recognised those treaties, that those boundary changes are now fixed. We're not going to complain about them anymore. We accept the fact we've lost that territory to those countries. So it's sending a signal to Britain and France that Germany was now changing her attitude towards them. And that signal worked. Okay, the Allies, when we say the Allies, we mean the British, the French and the Americans, now responded positively to Germany, and so they started to treat Germany more fairly, which is exactly what Stresemann wanted. And the first sign of that was in 1926, when they allowed Germany to join the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was an international peacekeeping organisation that had been set up after World War I. In particular, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was instrumental in creating that. He believed it was important to create world peace, to ensure world peace, And the best way to do that was to have an international peacekeeping organisation, a little bit similar to the United Nations that we have nowadays. But Germany had not been allowed to join that international organisation because she was effectively being treated as the guilty country of Europe. So now that Germany was cooperating, Germany was allowed to join, and that was a big success for Stresemann. Okay, she's now been treated almost as an equal by the British and the French. So he continued that strand further in 1928, when Germany, along with 64 other countries, 65 in total, signed what is called the Kellogg-Brienned Pact. Now that was a pact between these 65 nations in which the leaders of those nations renounced war as a tool for foreign policy. The countries should not resolve their international differences by fighting wars against each other. They should resolve their international differences by talking to each other over the conference table. So again, it was a very positive signal that Germany was no longer a warmongering nation. The Germany that had in 1914 attacked France was now gone. This was a new Germany that welcomed international peace. Now that's that for this particular podcast. As you can see at the bottom there, that the linking strand was Stresemann was also very famous for the help that he gave to the economy and the reparations, the steer he did on that, which was very much linked to his foreign policy, because he famously negotiated what we call the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, both of them with America. These economic policies, which we'll look at in the next podcast, were very much linked to his foreign policy. So that's the end of this first podcast. If you go on to the second podcast, which is about the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. Thank you.